our center of interest is going to be this little grove of trees, kind of offset a little bit on the left side of the painting. And I want to keep some nice negative shapes for these rocks that kind of surround this little grove of pine trees. And I'm going to take the paint away, and you see I've got a big blank piece of paper. For those of you who haven't already sketched anything, that's fine, because we're going to do a very minimal sketch. All I'm going to do is take a pencil and more or less just kind of give myself a real light kind of guide of where this little draw or canyon would be. And it just, that's about it. I'm not even going to draw the trees in, because we'll put those in after things dry. But what I do want to do is kind of delineate a few little rock shapes kind of around where this grove will be, so that I can protect that and keep it dry white paper. I don't know if you can even see the lines. I did them pretty thin. They're just a little bit, you know, of places where I want to protect the white of the paper. Okay, so when I wet my paper, I don't want to get any water in that area. I want to keep that dry, because we'll do some dry brush effects there. But in the meantime, I'm going to get a big flat brush and get it nice and wet. And I'm just going to basically wet my entire surface of my paper and kind of come down around where these rocks might be. And I'm only going to take it down about 3/4 of the way. And the bottom quarter of the page is going to be left dry, because we'll get that wet later, but that'll be a different approach to the technique of the painting. So from now, all I'm doing is making sure the surface of my paper is wet. Be sure and kind of look at the paper sideways to make sure you've hit all the wet surfaces. If you see any place that's kind of dull in the sheen or the glare and reflection of your lighting, you'll know that you have not gotten any water on the surface of the paper. So you want to make sure you go back and just get it nice and evenly damp, so that when you go to place your colors on the paper, because I don't want to get too rapid of a flow of pigment running down with gravity to the bottom of the page. So I've only got this elevated about 3/4 of an inch at the top. So now, using probably the same type of brush, I'm going to mix up. Well, let me talk a little bit about colors first. To convey a really kind of cold scene, I want to use some cool pigments. And rather than using staining colors, I'm going to use a lot of sedimentary colors. Why? Because sedimentary colors are fairly coarse, and they will not soak down into the fiber or the cotton of your paper. Instead, they'll sit up on top, and they'll move around with the water, and they'll be easy to manipulate, particularly if I want to bring in some clean water and purposefully create a bloom where the water is repelling the paint. If I use staining, really bright, transparent pigments, I won't be able to repel the pigment. It'll just immediately soak down into the paper, and it'll be stuck there. So we'll start off with the sky. I'm going to mix up a little bit of let's see, a little cobalt. Again, get a little bit of cobalt on my brush, maybe a little bit of rose mixed in with that. But primarily just a cool color. I'm not interested in getting this incredibly dark. I just want to kind of tint the paper in a couple places. And I'm just going to drop this in and let the gravity kind of pull some of these colors down. Might even use a little bit of manganese. If you don't have that, cerulean is good. They both are very granulating type pigments, which are beautiful in the sky. But you can see where I put a little rose in with the cobalt, and it kind of tinted and gave a warm color to some of the paper there. But I'm not trying to completely obliterate the white of the paper with this. I'm just laying it down gently, and I'm not worried about where my lines are. I'm just kind of in the general vicinity of where we're looking through these two hills to see part of the sky. Don't even need to do anything down here where they come together in the vortex of the angle, because my trees are going to obliterate that. I just wanted to get some initial tinting down. While this is wet, I'm going to go now and start mixing up some really pretty colors. And here's the colors I'm using. If you want to think about this, I'm using cobalt. I'll use a cobalt violet. It's like a bright violet, but it's a granulating sedimentary color as opposed to a staining color. And it will give a beautiful granulation. I'll use some cobalt light teal, also will granulate. A little cerulean, and then I'll occasionally warm it up with a little bit of raw umber. So we'll start off in my palette, some cobalt. So I've got a nice mixture of cobalt, and then I get my brush wet, and I got a nice mixture of this cobalt violet. So I've got both colors ready to go in my palette, nice and juicy. I don't have to worry too much about it being really wet because the paper's already wet. So if I can mix up a slightly drier mixture, it will work better. Okay, I'm starting with the cobalt violet, and I'm just going to lay it on the top of where my line was. And of course, it bleeds and feathers out right into the sky a little bit, which is okay because once this starts drying, I'll come back and redefine the edge of my mountain. But if some of it kind of goes up into the sky, that's great because it leaves sort of a little echo of these colors. And I'm dropping in now some cobalt blue around and near the cobalt violet. And then I'm going to get a little bit of turquoise. I've got off to the side, it's a little stronger pigment, but I'm going to drop a little bit of that in there. Maybe a little bit of the cobalt teal light. Drop some of that in. It has a slightly warmer, greener cast to it than what we've been using so far. And then I'll go back and maybe get some ultramarine. Ultramarine is a warmer, darker blue, but it also granulates very nicely. It'll give us a little slightly darker. You see how much darker the ultramarine goes? And I'm just dropping this in a few places where this hill is, or this mountainside is, to lay down some basic tints that have a variety of colors within them, but they all stay kind of a little bit, they all feel a little bit cool to the touch. And you can see they're running downhill. All this pigment is sliding down the paper because of my elevated board, but it's also separating due to the cold press texture of the paper. You're starting to see all this little bits of white come through that suggests granulation. And it's because the sedimentary pigment is dropping down into the little tooth and the trough within these little bits of texture on the paper. So now let's get a warmer color. I'm going to get some burnt sienna. Got just a touch of burnt sienna off to the side here, and I'm going to drop a little bit of that up in here. It just has just a pop of warmth in there. Whenever you start putting in cool colors, it's always good to have a couple of little accenting, contrasting, warm pops. I'm going to use a little bit of raw umber. Raw umber is a granulating sedimentary color. It's a cool beige, but it also has some nice warmth to it in contrast with the blues. And really drop in some nice darks in a couple spots. And then just keep working some of these rich colors. This is a little more saturated cobalt violet. It's like a bright violet, but it's sedimentary. And then I'll go back and get some, maybe some manganese or something that's got some blues in it. And then let's see if I can get a little viridian in here. I might have some off to the side. It's kind of a nice color. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot here. But basically, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to tip this up and let some of this stuff just start running. And what it's going to do is it's going to mix within, one color mixing into the next. And you saw that some of that dripped across my white paper where my snowfields are. Not a problem. You just take a clean brush, tissue, and you can just kind of get rid of any drips across there. But what's happening now is a lot of these colors are starting to mingle and mix and neutralize a little bit. We still have these pops of really cool and really warm colors. It's granulating nicely, but they're unifying as they mix. It's like when you take all your colors and mix them up in your mixing well, but they're staying brighter because they have been just put on the paper and allowed to mix by themselves. I'm going to take the tape out from underneath my board and lay it totally flat. And now what I want to do is start introducing some darker pigments down closer to the base of this mountain. And I'll mix them up with a little bit of burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, and I get a really nice, rich dark. These are both still sedimentary colors. But what I'm trying to do is set this up so that when I take, I've got a kind of a workhorse flat here. You can see this flat. It's a 1-inch flat. I'm not going to put any color on it. I'm just going to put a little water on it. And I want to drop some of this into the base of the mountain. And you see what's happening? It immediately starts repelling that dark color. And that's what creates these really intense feelings of blowing snow. If you can just start dropping in droplets of water into that rich area, it starts moving around on its own. And I'll come back and I'll start, as my paper starts to settle down a little bit, and it's not quite as wet as it was, I can go and redefine the edge of that mountain. It's not quite ready yet. So while I'm waiting for that to happen, I'll get some more of my ultramarine and mix it with my cobalt violet and get some of the water off my brush. I want it to be a drier mixture so it's not as wet. And I'll come back over here at the top of this hill and I'm just going to create an edge that follows that and then add a little bit of some teal to that. That's probably a little too much. I'm going to take the tape out from underneath my board so that it just sits there and kind of gradually mixes with the other colors. I'm going to add a little bit of the raw umber and just start bringing this down very quickly. And you see I'm using a big brush, and it works very quickly when you use a big brush, but I want to warm up this hill a little bit. So I'm just going to drop some raw umber right into that big wet shape. And you see what it does? It just kind of does a nice job of softening and warming up that area a little. And I can always take a little bit of burnt sienna, and drop them in a couple spots just to give myself a pop of warmth. And then I'm going to take some of the bright violet and drop a few pops of that into a couple spots. Now this is so wet right now that if I just let it sit here, it's going to gradually start spreading and moving around and mixing and mingling with the colors adjacent to it, and you'll get really nice effect. Clean my brush, get a little bit more of the ultramarine. I don't want it to be too intense or saturated. And I'm just going to kind of cool off the bottom of where this was warm and just drop in some nice cool glaze. It's just not even, and some of this has got a little cobalt from my palette, but it's just very light. And I'll let some of this water, I'm picking up the bottom edge of my board and letting this backflow towards the top of the paper. And it just creates a really nice, transparent, thin mid-tone, very light tone. Now, I'm losing some of this really white area over here, so I'm going to clean my brush and just drop in some droplets of clean, fresh water in a couple places next to some of this really darker pigmentation. And you'll see it starts to repel that paint, particularly if I come back in with a little bit of really dark. I picked up some royal blue or like a Prussian blue. It's a staining color. It's very dark. I'm going to add a little bit of quinacridone burnt orange to this, which is a really staining dark color. And I'll let that sit there on the paper, clean my brush thoroughly, and then just drop a little bit of water along the edge of this. Now, some of you may think I'm going pretty fast, but everything's wet and you have to move quickly to take advantage of the wet surface to get this reaction that we're after, to get all these different effects happening. As the paper starts to dry a little bit more, we'll be able to come back in and add additional pigments and colors and things that will make it feel pretty nice. But I'm just adding some darks here, clean my brush thoroughly, and just drop in some really fresh water there that just kind of explodes and reacts and repels that dark pigment. And sometimes you just take your finger, you can just throw something on there and it does some amazing things. So you got it. This is not for the faint of heart. You have to be brave and just jump right in with both feet and fingers and let it do its thing. Now I'm going to get a little bit of cobalt, cool the bottom of this off a little bit. I kind of like what's happening on this hill. I want to get it a little bit, I'm going to take a clean brush. It's totally dry. Just get it slightly damp. And I'm going to soften the edge of this hill a little bit. Now that the things have settled down a little bit, I'm just going to just barely soften an edge, add a little bit of water to it so it just kind of goes up into the sky and doesn't give me a hard edge. I don't want the mountains in the background to be so defined that that's the first thing we look at. I just want to use it as a backdrop to create these really rich, beautiful colors. I'm going to take some bright violet and some cobalt, mix up kind of a drier mixture of a really deep, rich violet. Take my tape out from under it so it's laying flat. I'm going to get all the wet around the edges away, wicked up. And I'm going to use this brush now to see if I can't get a little stronger edge in a couple spots here. Clean my brush, wipe all the water off of it, wring it out, and use that to just kind of pull this deep color back into the mountainside. See how we have a soft feathery edge along the top of that mountain? It's pretty nice. It doesn't really give us a clear definition of the mountain. We'll be able to do that shortly. But for now, I'm just going to take a tissue and kind of wick up and soften some of the edges along the bottom where it gets lighter and where that snow is blowing in the valley. And I've got a huge puddle of water here. I'm going to take my rigger and just use it as a straw to wick up all this excess moisture so that it has a chance to kind of settle down at an even rate. I like some of this dark, but I'm going to throw some of this out here in the middle, maybe get a little more of it and just sprinkle some of that into that wet area. And then clean my rigger completely and drop some nice big droplets of water into this area and see if we can't get a nice explosion of repelling paint that looks like a bloom is occurring. And everybody's painting is going to look totally different because the paint reacts differently depending on how much pigmentation you have, what colors you use, and this becomes very individual painting. Everybody's will look very different, which is going to be very exciting to see, when you start posting your pictures. Now, I've got this really light area up here in the upper right area. I'm going to get some nice, rich, saturated blend, and you can see it in my palette. I'm just kind of getting a nice raw umber, and I'm just going to pop some of this in there and then get my tape underneath the board so that it runs downhill slightly. Maybe even accelerate it by just lifting the board slightly. Throw a little bit more on there and then get some more of that cobalt violet, but have this run right in the middle of all that. So you've got some cool beige and some warm violet, and it all just kind of mixes together and blotting up a little bit of this stuff down here at the base. But now you see where I touched the edge of this other mountain on the left side with the damp brush. It wasn't wet, it was just slightly damp, and I was just softening that edge. But it's like the wind has picked up a little bit of stuff off the trees and it's blowing up into the sky. And I'd like to see a little bit more of that on the other side too. So I'm going to throw some wet pigment along this part of the hill, clean my brush, and see if I can't pull a little bit of damp from the sky right down and touch the side of that hillside a little bit. Maybe just take some water and sprinkle it on there and just soften where it's up in the sky and just blot up any color so that it just lifts a little bit of that edge on the mountainside. And this is a really very loose way to paint. It's because the water is really doing all the control. The water is moving the pigment around. We're just kind of along for the ride to see what happens. and it's very experimental. You don't exactly know what you're going to get, but sometimes you have to just pick the whole board up and let the water kind of start moving across the surface. And it creates just a beautiful effect, especially since we're using all these sedimentary colors that granulate. And in a little bit, we'll start using brighter staining colors after the water after the paper starts to dry a little bit. And I've got a big light spot here, and I think later after this dries, it's going to look a little odd. So I need to get some of this wet umber to kind of flow down into that area, and you can gently stroke across the surface of your paper with a brush and just pull some of that. I'm going to put a little bit of bright violet or cobalt violet in there too, and then just let that, I'm tipping up my board, letting it just kind of run downhill so you get some of that drippy effect coming through the wet and wet areas. And kind of like the effect of what it's doing. Now I've got all these darks starting to collect along the bottom edge. I'm going to take my 1-inch flat, clean it. I've cleaned it off. I've squeezed all the water out of it. And now I'm just going to get just a little bit of pure water, take the tape out from under my board and pick up the part of the board that's closest to me and tip it up so that the water flows away from me into this rich mixture of paint that's still very wet. And it's going to start blooming. It's going to start repelling and reacting with these other colors. And if I drop just a big droplet in there, I'm going to take a bigger roll of tape and just stick it on here so that my board now sits immobile. It's not moving. It gives the water a chance to react with the paint and do its thing without me constantly moving the board. Because the more you move the board, the more things are going to start changing. All I'm doing now is taking a clean, damp brush. I've squeezed all the water out of it, and I'm just cleaning up this edge where the wind might be blowing along the bottom of the valley here, and just giving myself a soft, very light edge where the hill comes down into the valley. I'm going to clean up some of the splash that's in my foreground. You never know what's going to show up, but I'm pretty happy with what we've got. So I'm going to stop here and take any questions, give you guys a chance to complete your painting, and try not to do too much so that you can see what's happening as I let this dry. I'm pretty satisfied with what we've got as an effect. Now it's up to the paper to dry and give us, you know, a nice background color with this granulated, very organic, a mountainside that's full of color. And the majority of these colors, even though there's some violets in there, they have a dominant coolness to them. And that's really what we were after, is getting that coolness into the side of the mountain to make it feel like it was kind of a cold day. I'm going to put a little bit of green up in here. My paper is starting to kind of settle down a little bit. If you feel like it might be drying too much, you can always use a little squirt bottle, a misting bottle, and just give it a half a squirt, and it lifts the pigment back up off the surface so that it can start moving across the surface and mix with colors that are adjacent to us. And I just wanted to have a little bit of a green cast in 1 or 2 spots there. I have one over here with the cobalt light teal, you can see on the left hill, but I didn't really have much green in my mixes of violets and blues and umbers. And just putting a little bit over here on this side of the hill kind of balances it. It's slightly darker in value than what I've got on the left hill. What I've done is create a darker value overall on my hillside that's on the right. And my right hillside is about twice as big or twice as dominant as the hill on the left. And the one on the left is a little lighter in value overall. As you said, it's kind of more pastelish, and that makes it feel like it's more distant. You're creating atmospheric perspective. Now, I never stop working the water when I'm doing a wet and wet like this. And I'm also, my paper, even though it's 300 pounds, it's starting to get a little buckle in here, and I'm getting a trough of water that's starting to collect. So I got to be careful about putting too much water in that spot. But I also want to go back to my raw umber and my ultramarine blue, both mix up fairly dry, and drop in some darks in a few spots here because as it dries, it's lightening. Why does it lighten when it dries? It's because 70% of the mixture is water. And when the water evaporates and dries, it doesn't leave much pigment behind. So you have to mix a drier mix of pigment to water on your brush before you go back into a wet, damp surface. And so that's kind of a key thing that's very important. That's probably too warm. I want to get um, a cooler place down here at the bottom. So I'm going to drop in a little bit of cobalt, and that's probably very wet. So I'm going to try to push a little clean water right up against the edges of it so I get a soft, feathery edge. And then I can always take my rigger wherever I put it. Where did it go? Hiding under my board. These things roll around. And I'm going to just drop in some droplets now on this surface, just sprinkling little dewdrops, because these will also start blooming and create little soft effects on the bottom of that hill. And with the snow coming down and all the texture, and as you're looking through the wind, it just makes it feel a little more distant. All right, at this point, I'm ready to let this dry. So because I want to locate my trees. I want to start thinking a little bit about that kind of the rugged rocks and the rocky surfaces that are in this valley here around the trees. And I can't do that if everything is really wet. So this is a chance for you guys to get caught up, keep painting, and I will hopefully answer any questions you might have. I'm wicking up some of these beads of water because I've got the bottom edge of my board elevated and the top edge of my board downhill. So everything is running away from the valley slightly as it dries, and it's creating these little beads at the top of the mountain. So I can always take a little bit of water, throw a little bit more of this little sprinkles of surface water. I'm going to take the tape out so it dries flat now. I was elevating it before just to get some elevation and get some movement, but I don't need that movement anymore. I've got it about where I want it to dry. And I'll just take a tissue and kind of watch this. And I can kind of wick up and blot up any of the excess, almost clear moisture along the bottom edge here, so that it doesn't keep pulling that pigment down to the edge. If I do this, it just really kind of softens and prevents the capillary action of pulling all that rich pigment down into the damp, clear spot within my paper. So I've got a nice soft edge down along the bottom of that side. This side's barely visible. I can take a kind of a stiffer, clean brush, and I can erase any dry lines where it's starting to dry, just to make sure I don't have anything showing up. Take a tissue, a dry tissue, and just kind of blot that edge. So it just goes from, a very pale mid-tone down to nothing. And that's really the effect I want. I want to protect the bottom part of my paper and my foreground for the rest of the painting that's going to be closer to us. I got some nice splatters in the sky. If you get that, you can usually take a clean, just slightly damp brush, and you can generally take care of it. I don't like what I just did. So I'm going to take some of this real pale pigment that's here in my palette, see if I can't get a nice lavender bit of sky going. And we'll just kind of cover up those dots and just being brave and jumping in there and covering up where you had a blemish. All right, I'm going to take my heat gun, which doesn't make any noise, and I'm just going to help accelerate some of this drying time so that the pigment starts to lose that high sheen. And when you start to go to a matte finish, it's still very wet, but it doesn't keep moving across the surface of the paper. You always want to get to the point where all this background stuff stops moving. It could still be wet, no problem with that, but is the minute you move your board, you elevate one side of it, the pigment starts moving either uphill or downhill, depending on which way you angle the paper. And so by accelerating this drying time a little bit, it helps us kind of get everything to settle down and not be moving. And then I can focus more on our center of interest and the trees, the grove, and start figuring out what we're going to do next. As far as the location of our center of interest, we've already created this little pinch of light that comes down through between the two hills. That's where I'm going to position probably about 3 trees. You can have 3 trees, 5 trees, but don't do 2 trees or 4 trees. Why? Because everything feels more natural in nature if you have an asymmetrical number. The rule of threes is always good. If you feel like you need to have a little bit more, you can go to 5. But if you have just 2 trees, it's like a pair. And if you have 4 trees, it's a little too symmetrical. The other thing is we want to kind of get them all different heights, and we want to have an uneven distance between each one. I'm going to bring my original painting back so you can see it. I have more than 3 trees here, but there's basically 1, 2, 3 big shapes for trees. And then I put in a few little things that just to kind of as accents around the base. But these are going to have some of my staining transparent colors, also the like phthalo blues, royal blues, quinacridone, burnt orange. Those are all really very staining, transparent colors, but when they're mixed together, they make really lively darks. So we can really create some rich, lively darks with our trees using the more staining colors. But we have to have the surface of the paper completely dry before we can do that. Otherwise, it starts mingling and mixing with these sedimentary colors and gets kind of muddy. I'm happy with how ragged the edge of this mountain is, because my trees that are going to be closer to the viewer than this mountain are going to be much more defined. They're what we want the viewer to focus on. It's because you want to establish what a true dark is compared to a barely there light value. And that gives you the bookends of how light you can go and how dark you can go as you complete your painting. If you don't do this, you just keep adding what looks like darker colors, but it's all water. And by the time everything dries, you have a painting full of midtones. And you have to establish pretty early on a nice, dry, dark that visually tells you, okay, that's what a true dark looks like. Now I can work all the way between the white of the paper and that really dark, and it gives me the full range of values to work with. My paper is still very, very wet. I want to give you guys plenty of time to get caught up on this. I'm not going to do these rocks down here until I get my trees fairly well established, but I am going to take a pencil now and give myself a little bit of definition with a couple of rocks. And I don't want these to all be exactly the same. I want some to have a little angular surface to them. Some are bigger, some are like a big jelly bean, some are, just different shapes. And variety is really what makes things work. And as I start painting, I may not even follow these lines, but visually it gives me a little bit of guidance on what I can and can't do. Let me see if I can't make this a little bigger so you can see what I'm trying to do. Does that help at all? Can you see that on the screen? Just put a couple of shapes. Now, why am I just putting the top halves of the rocks on? Because I'm going to paint behind these little half circles to make the tops of these white as negative shapes. And you'll see as we get into this what that does. But my trees are literally going to be right about across this center area. You can kind of see what my intention is. It's more or less like that. I just laid a couple pencils down. That gives you kind of an idea, and where the placement of my center of interest is off center makes it a better design from a compositional standpoint. So to get my placement, I really don't want to get too defined too quickly. So I'm just going to take a big flat brush, and I have a really nice, can you see that? How sharp that that edge is on that brush. And look how long or how wide that is. If I get a little bit of raw umber on this, and I keep that edge, that knife edge pretty sharp, I can come back in here and just barely, look at my sky is still wet. Wow. But I can, there's my trees. All that is a center line that helped guide me when I start to develop my tree shapes. But it tells me one thing, I've got to make sure that my sky is drier, because when I went in and repaired those little blemishes by glazing over the sky, it left the surface of the paper still a little bit wet. So I'm going to make sure that my sky is nice and dry so I can get some nice tree shapes. And I certainly do not want to paint individual boughs and have each one defined. I just want to have some loose brush strokes that kind of simulate what a pine tree in the forest would look like. And for that, I want to use, just a little mop brush. I have a whole variety of sizes. Let me show you. I love these brushes. Brush for all seasons, see? And I go all the way up to a really fat one. So they're really nice. And for this one, for these tree shapes, I want to get something that's pretty pliable, holds enough water that I can do more than one of these tree boughs all at the same time. I'll get my brush wet, and we'll get a little bit of raw umber, maybe a little cobalt in there. So I've got a nice rich color, and I'm just gonna kind of have a couple of real loose sweeps as I come across these tree shapes. See, I'm not trying to paint too much detail. I'm just allowing these colors and the paint to flow right off the edge of my brush. And I got a little dry brush there. That's a nice, happy, lucky surprise. If I want to extend the top of this, I'll just take the back end of my brush handle and drag it through that puddle until I can get a nice, richer bit of trees. And I've got this tree behind me. All these boughs run one into the other. And I'm going to get some transparent orange. It's a very staining, transparent color, very bright. And I'm going to add a little bit of orange in there and go back and get some quinacridone burnt orange with some, what shall I use? A little bit of green maybe, or actually blue. And just kind of drop my brush in there and get a little bit of a dry brush effect in a couple spots. And then I'll go get some deeper green, maybe a little turquoise. Has a nice brightness to it. And I've got another tree I'm going to put over here. And with the tip of this brush, it stays pretty sharp. I can create some darks. And this is a real transparent staining green that I've got. And it's got turquoise and raw umber and quinacridone burnt orange in it. So it works pretty nice. But you can see I've got lots of options to add different colors in here. I'm going to take a little bit of the royal blue, which is a really deep, dark blue that's staining. And I can come in and create some darks in the middle of some of these trees just to create depth. And clean my brush and go get a different color. Maybe I'll get a sedimentary color now, a kind of a burnt sienna. And then I clean my brush and I'll get maybe a alizarin red or alizarin crimson. Come in next to this deep blue that I had. And now down at the bottom of the trees, guess what? You don't see the trees anymore. You just see dark shapes. It all gets dark. And this is where I start bringing that wet pigment, that mixture of pigment that I've got, down towards the rocks. And I'm going to take some of the turquoise and the quin burnt orange, which is a nice rich dark. And I'm going to elevate my board so that this dark pigment kind of rolls down into the tops of these rocks. And I'm just going to create a couple of places. So let's go back and get some cobalt teal. It's got some really bright colors to it. Drop that in there, let it mix with some of these other colors, get some cobalt blue in there. And then we just kind of move in and around and among these rocks. and leave a little bit of white where the tops of the rocks would be so that we can start to develop a landscape that's more painterly. It's not something that's real obvious. It's just, it's a feeling that we're creating by leaving some of these bits of light at the top of the rocks that might be covered with snow. They might have some different, I'm going to drop, while this is wet here, I'm just dropping some darks into some of these wet shapes to create little punctuation. But as I move through this, I'm going to get some pinks, which are have a little bit of more warmth to them, and then add some cobalt blues to that, some violets. And we'll just allow, and it's mostly water, so when that dries, it'll be a nice, rich mixture, but it's too much the same. So I'm going to add a little bit of different colors, get more of a violet thing going on. And then come back with some darker blues. So we're down in the little crevices, we're starting to see shadows. And then I go back to my raw umber, and I've got hardly any water on it at all, so it's very dry, and it creates these nice little pops of dark. Mix that with a little bit of the cobalt violet, maybe, and some blues, and I've got some nice things happening. I'm going to just clean my brush now and take a damp brush and soften some of these marks, the tops of the darks as they go back up into the shapes above them, and just soften them and let them just kind of roll around so that we start to see more shadowy shapes, like with cerulean blues, and just glaze across some of these white negative shapes. We'll still see the shape, but it softens it, makes it less obvious. Over here, I want to get just some barely there rock shapes that are off in the distance. Add a little bit of cool blue to it, like a cerulean above that, and let it blend right in. And over here, we'll just add water to these and let them just start coming across as a nice soft shape. And then as we get down underneath these rocks, it gets very pale, very, very delicate transparencies. And I'm just kind of dragging water across and letting the water touch these deposits of pigment that I had, and it creates real subtle kind of shadow shapes. You don't have to be too blatant. You can just kind of let the water grab some of that pigment and drag it through shapes, and it's fine. And we'll come back in and put some shadows across these rock shapes once this is all dry, and we'll be able to really create a nice negative shapes with some darks within them. And I'm just dropping into the wet shapes little bits of violet and blues, create some nice variety. And a knuckle print there. Who hasn't dragged their knuckle through paint, contaminated the white paper before? We all do it. Okay, so we'll let that dry for a minute. I'm going to take my hair dryer, my heat gun, and just get rid of some of the water that's in these wet shapes, so I can go back in and start adding some more dark shadows beneath these trees. The trees have some brilliant color in them, but as we get down towards the bottom of the trees, they get darker and darker or they have to get darker and darker because they're in shadow. So I'm mixing up just a bunch of darks in my palette. And I'm going to come back in now and just drop in a little bit more dark here and there, being kind of thoughtful about those shapes that are rocks. Some of them are softer, some of them are fairly hard, negative shapes, but that's what makes some of them feel closer to us, and while others are feeling farther away. Looking for my cleanup brush. Here it is. I have a little short brush, and sometimes I can come back in and soften or erase a light shape and just soften them a little bit. And it just is a nice way to feather things into the white of the paper. So we have a nice transition from just a little tint to the white without seeing hard dry lines. Okay, it's starting to take shape. We need some more darks in a few places, but as we let this dry, I don't know, some of you have painted with me before. You've heard me say you've got to be patient. You've got to let things dry before you go back in and add more paint. If I were to go back in and add more paint to get some of these areas darker, it would just turn to mud. Because if I want to preserve the brilliant colors in my center of interest, I have to let those colors set. How do you set a staining color? You let it dry. How many of you have stained clothes and threw them in the hamper, and then a week later you realize, oh, I didn't soak it right when I stained it, and now the color is set. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to set these staining colors so that the beautiful colors within them remain vivid, and then we can come back in and add some more darks to really accentuate the base of the trees and the shadows. So this was a good time now to take a hairdryer and really accelerate that drying process so that the pigment sets in the fiber of the cotton of the paper. And I'm always testing. Now, the rest of my paper is almost dry where we did those mountains in the back. But as these trees in the center of interest start to dry, what's happening? They're all a dark midtone. I don't have any really true darks within them. So somewhere within the little holes that you look through the trees, there needs to be some dark shadows. And we don't want them to be too hard edged. We just want to see darks in there and have the edge soften. So I'm going to take some nice darks in a few places, clean my brush, and soften parts of the edges of those dark deposits that I just put in here. So it just really kind of, you can't really distinguish exactly what you're looking at, but it feels like you're looking into the depths of those trees and shadows. And then as I come down around the base of some of these rocks, I'm using some of that same dark, but I want to warm some of it up by getting a little bit more raw umber, so it's not so cold. And then we'll just start adding a little bit of maybe some alizarin crimson, put a little bit of that in there in a few spots, let it hit some of those dark blues and just soften. But for the most part, now the base of the tree is starting to get really nice and dark. And I'm just going to get a little bit more wet in here. And I've got the opportunity now to put some really small, delicate trees in here. I'll get a little bit of that raw umber that we were using, and I'll just put a few little. Now I need to get a sharper point and use the one I was using. And we'll just put a couple of little deadfall trees, things that are not real obvious. And we'll put maybe one over here. And this one's pretty dark as opposed to the ones that are colorful. And I'm using a cool dark, like a deep Prussian blue or a phthalo blue or something. And it'll feel like it's back behind some of this other stuff. And I just literally almost create negative shapes by painting the dark in behind some of these more colorful, lighter midtones that we have. Just bring them out a little bit like that. And then I'm going to go back now and get a little bit of orange and a little bit of the raw umber and create a couple of little tree shapes that come across this lighter area where the wind is kind of blown. And I can even take a really small brush and get a nice fine point to it and put some dead branches that are coming off of it, like so. Very delicate, maybe something in front of this rock here a little bit, just to give the effect that there's other things happening here. Maybe one way over here, just a delicate one and then we'll add a little bit of this teal right behind the rock. So it feels like it's coming out of the shadows there, and we'll just soften the top edge of that. Rinse my brush and feather away the top edge of that mark. So it's just kind of a little bit of a shadow behind that rock. Now, I'm looking at this. You're always supposed to be kind of evaluating as you paint. And these trees are all the same size. So I want my main tree to be a little bit taller. So I'm going to extend the top of that tree just a little bit, just to give it a little bit more drama. And it up against that sky, it becomes a nice positive shape that really is a little more dramatic. There we go. And we got some limbs coming off this other thing. But now we'll stop here for a minute and get some really nice dark. I want to get like a quinacridone burnt orange and my phthalo blue or royal blue. And I'm going to put the base of my trees coming through some of these darks here. We'll see bits and pieces of them against those midtones. So it feels like we're seeing the shadowy side of these tree trunks coming down into the shadows. Maybe we'll just take some of that dark on a brush and just drag it through so it's just raggedy. It's all those nice darks in amongst the trees. And what does that do? We've got all this snow down here in the foreground. We've got a light sky. That darkest dark draws our attention. It creates the value contrast we're after. All right, now let's start thinking about painting the rest of this. I think I want to dry this first so I don't run the chance of getting a little bit muddy. But the foreground, I'm going to bring my painting back and show you where we're going with this. You see how really delicate and dry brush some of these snowbanks are? Let me see if I can you see that a little better now? We're using a mixture of cobalt blues, some quinacridone rose, opera if you've got it, a little bright violet, but some of this is wet, some of it's dry, but it's more like a glaze over this white field of snow that we've left. The paper is still the white of the paper here. So we've got to work fairly wet. I'm going to take my brush because I've got so much dark in my mixing well, it would be almost impossible to really do this nice, delicate dance of snow in the foreground if I leave all this dark in my palette. So I'm going to clean my palette, just take a damp, flat brush and then a tissue, and I'll just create a nice place where I can mix up some very pale glazes. The glazing is really about the value that we want for this foreground. It's going to be real delicate, very transparent, something that we can see pretty well. I think you can see both my mixing area. Hopefully you don't have too much of a gallery view there. I'm trying to get rid of there. I got rid of everybody's thumbnail picture so you can see the mixing well. And what I'm going to do is use my a big mop, this mop brush, and mix up a little bit of cobalt. That's kind of the base. You always want to work with your cooler color. The cobalt as a glaze is a very clean looking color. It's cool, which is what we want. But then we also want to have some bright violet. The bright violet that I use is Holbein's, and it's a extremely staining, transparent color. So when it mixes with these, it creates a beautiful violet color. And what I want to do is start off and lay down a little bit of cool with this cobalt. And I'll zero in here so you can kind of see what I'm about. And see if I can't get this a little lower for you. All right, now I'm going to come off of the side of this with just a little bit, and this is a big puddle of water on my brush. And I'm just going to kind of very quickly take a few strokes, and then I'm going to soften the top edge of this. So it just feels like it's tucking down into maybe a little bit of a white highlighted area within the snow is getting some sunlight on it or something. And then I'll pick up some of that violet, that bright violet, drop that in a few spots and let it mix and mingle with the blue in a couple spots, and then keep it fairly pale over here. It's almost like shadows going across your field of snow. Some are cooler, some are not so cool. They got a little bit of warmth to them. I'm going to take a smaller brush now that's clean and just slightly damp, and I'm going to soften and pick up a little bit of the excess water, and I'll just drag it across, almost get like a dry brush effect. I can just drag this through there and get more of the violet mixed with a little bit of the cobalt in my foreground. Go back and get a little cooler color over in here just to kind of cool this off a little bit. And then just add water so it softens. I'll leave a little bit of the hard edge there with the dry brush so that you just start to feel movement within the foreground. And as it gets closer to the viewer down here, we get a little warmer, and you just kind of have to design it yourself the way you want your painting to appear, because this is a very individual way. You're just making some nice strokes. You're trying to soften some things. You're going to drop in some nice cooler colors in a few spots, but keep it fairly wet. Drop a few of these darks in here just to change the values within those soft snow shapes. I'm going to take a clean flat brush and come across here and just lift any of the lighter colors to the middle. And then take the tissue and lift that. See what happened? I dripped some water right on there. This is all still so wet that doesn't matter. I'm going to put another roll of tape on top of the other one to get a little bit more angle. I'm starting to see some of this rolling downhill. I really like that effect. So I'm going to get a little deeper, darker bit of cobalt blue in there, and just elevate my board pretty extreme. So I've got a nice little bit of color, and I'll take a flat, clean it, get some nice fresh cobalt on there, and maybe come across here with a little bit of it, and then maybe just a little bit of raw umber in a couple spots. Pick it up, soften it in places so it just suggests, I've got all this cool stuff going, so I want to have just a few touches of warmth in a couple spots here. And then you just make sure you soften them. Anytime you put a brush stroke on paper, you should come back and take one edge of it, and it's up to you which edge you want. But I like how this is feathering a little bit. This has got sort of a hard edge here. We're going to end up putting a shadow across this negative shape just to cool it off. But I want to make sure that I leave some areas softer. That raw umber, even though it's a cool beige, when it's next to all this cobalt and this cool violet, it really adds little pops of warmth, almost like bits of the terrain that are kind of exposed through the banks of snow, and we're seeing little bits and pieces of warmth in an otherwise very cold environment. And it's creating some really interesting effects. I want to get a little bit more dark back here behind this area, so I'm going to come back in and add some darks in here just with a dark brush, and then I'll lay my board a little bit flat, take one of my little squirt guns, and just hitting the top edge of these marks, I want to add just a little bit of mist to soften those. And it just really kind of anchors that mountain. And now while that's wet, I'll take a brush with just plain water in it and drop a little bit next to those darks. And it just repels the paint. Just creates these really kind of beautiful effects that are pretty awesome. And the reason I say they're awesome is we can't create them. The paint and the water are doing all the work for us. We're just kind of suggesting where they might go and hoping for the best. And that's a horrible thing to tell the average viewer. But as painters, you have to understand that that's a key part of what we do, is enjoying the ride with all of this, this medium. It's just so unpredictable. But if we can figure out different ways to make it work, and then let the water do its thing, it just creates these awesome effects that are so yummy and juicy and just so exciting to be part of. And I'm adding a little bit of violet in here now next to these blues, just to give it some warmth, maybe a little cobalt violet. We'll go back to a sedimentary color and try that. But I like how it's just creating these really interesting little darks against those lighter areas, lighter fields. And again, I'm going to soften the tops of a lot of these marks so they don't look like a brushstroke. They look like shadows back in the distance. I've got a kind of a really intense bloom here. I'm just going to leave it alone. I don't really, it doesn't bother me that much. The one thing I could do is clean my brush and get a deeper, darker cobalt. And I think that's what it needs, is a little bit of a cobalt glaze coming right across it. And it just de-emphasizes that a little bit. And it kind of anchors this corner of the painting with a little more intensity, keeping this side a little lighter. But the top edge of it, I want to make sure is softened. All right, so we'll let that dry for a minute. I'm going to raise this up so it kind of is more square in the screen. And you can kind of see what's happening now. I'm going to let this dry. I'll let you catch up. And then I'm going to put some vegetation coming through, some of the snow. And then as a final step, we'll throw on some blowing snow and some falling snow with some gouache. But with the exception of a few darks and the majority of our trees in our center of interest, everything we've used in this painting is a sedimentary color. And the effect that you get in these background hill shapes is full of granulation. It's full of texture. It's got a variety of colors from warms and cools, but a dominant coolness to it. And it just feels like it's off in the distance, and we're kind of squinting our eyes looking through the snowstorm, seeing what's remaining there in the distance. And if anybody have ever been caught in a snowstorm where it's coming down pretty heavy, you really can't see through the filter of the falling snow. All you see are these distant shapes, and you'll see some darks, you'll see some midtones, but we don't want to see really defined shapes way off in the distance. It's more of a feeling that we get. And this is by using these sedimentary colors and wet, we get that opportunity to really play up the atmospheric effect of distance. And I've got some nice little explosions of bloom, of whites, where the pure water has pushed away these darker pigments, creating some really nice effects. This is kind of losing all of its color as the water evaporates. So I'm going to go back in and just add a little bit more dark in that one spot. Take my rigger, wherever it went, where'd it go? And just sprinkle a little bit of water on top of it so it blooms. And then maybe right in here, we'll soften this. Where's my cleanup brush? Anywhere you've got a hard edge along here, you may want to come back with a stiffer brush and just soften it a little bit. And it makes it feel like the mist and the snow is blowing, and we don't really see any hard edges. They're just kind of transitioning from the white blowing snow to these really, soft, beautiful colors that we start to see. And so this is an opportunity now to go back in and just kind of lift a little bit. And if you remember, one of the unique characteristics of sedimentary colors is they don't stain the paper. You can come back in with a stiffer brush like this that's clean and just slightly damp, and you can literally lift some of these sedimentary colors right off the paper, right back to the white of the paper, and get these beautiful, soft, misty type effects that just add so much of the undulation of the landscape and the terrain that makes it really kind of exciting. I'm leaving a little bit of a hard edge there. I kind of like that. Every once in a while you'll see a little bit of a hard edge with something, but for the most part, it's all pretty soft because of the blowing snow. So we've got some really nice things happening. And the next thing is to make sure it's dry. And then we'll put in some little strokes that would simulate the maybe some of the reeds of grass or something coming through the some of these areas where we put some I put a little bit of raw umber in there. It softened. It turned out nice. I can now take a dry brush with some more raw umber and just add a little bit of dark in a couple spots. And look what that does. It just sort of anchors where things are coming through the snow. And I can take a small little calligraphy brush, get some yellow ochre, maybe some gamboge, and I can put, some little bits of vegetation that are kind of peeking up through the snow. I want to get a little bit of orange in there. Make sure I've got some dry brush. It goes on kind of scratchy like dry brush, and it just is fairly soft. A little alizarin crimson in there too, just to give it a little more dark against that white background. And I want to come up high enough that I connect what's behind to what's in front. So the hillside is behind, the blowing snow is in the midground. These little things of grass are kind of going all the way up. Maybe there are bits of willow and stuff that are kind of peeking through some of the snowbanks. But it just suggests that there's stuff going on there. Maybe that's a stump. We'll add some nice dark on the backside of that. Colors are right here in the center of interest, and that's where the contrast occurs next to the whites of the snowbank. I can take a small mop brush and create a really delicate, thin bit of cobalt blue and create some shadow across some of these rocks. So they're not blatantly white, but they're still lighter shapes than everything around them. And there you go. So now we'll dry. And then I'll get a separate little mixing tray to put some white gouache in. I don't know if anybody brought white gouache with them to the party, but a little bit of white gouache with a toothbrush should do the trick. This has just got some fairly soft bristles on it. And then I never put gouache into my mixing tray. I have a little separate plastic thing that I put some gouache in so I don't contaminate my transparent watercolor. And I'll put just a little squirt of titanium white on here, and we'll get a little bit of water on the end of this toothbrush. It's just slightly damp, but you don't want to hold your toothbrush right over the painting, because if some of this gouache has got a lot of water in it, it could drop off as a big blob on your painting. So I'm mixing it in pretty well into my toothbrush, and then I hold my hand a little bit away from the painting, off to the side, and just very gently kind of stroke the top of the toothbrush and come around the painting. And if I want bigger blobs of snowflakes, I just get a little more water on here to get bigger droplets. Mix it up. And you're only going to see little snowdrops wherever there's dark. You won't see anything where it's light. So that's why we work so hard to get our mountain kind of dark in the background. And now we've got this little screen of this white snowdrops. There's falling snow that it kind of obliterates some of the hard edges. And it really makes it feel like, oh, there's some snow coming down. And if you want to get just a little bit bigger drops somewhere, you can take a rigger and then just drop a few bigger drops in a couple of spots, so you get variety in there. Clean your brush, clean your toothbrush. Don't mix them in with your palette, and that should do the trick. And your signature ought to be pretty much, similar to the textures you've already established in your painting. And in this case, we've got this vegetation that's kind of coming up in a warm tone. I'll use probably a One of the colors that we've already used in here, which might be a alizarin crimson or a little bit of bright violet, and put it on my smaller calligraphy brush and get some bright violet going. Touch of alizarin so it's nice and staining, because I want to be able to read it. And then I'll just come right in here and just that's similar to the textures that are already there. It balances what's going on. This is the signature is a balance to your center of interest. The hillsides have lots of rich color, but it's a dominant coolness. They've got a lot of texture within them because they're sedimentary pigments primarily. And you can see in the dark, shadowy areas beneath my trees, we lost all definition. It's just all shadows. You don't need to have a lot of individual branches, because as the viewer's eye looks at this, they're going to see the overall shape of a grove of trees, and their brain is going to register, oh, those are trees, and there's some rough terrain at the base, set off by some of these little highlights of negative shapes that would indicate snow on top of rock lumps underneath the snow. And it just feels like a kind of a cold winter mountain scene that is very impressionistic. It's got lots of um, movement within it. It's got colors you probably wouldn't normally see this vividly. We've kind of pushed the envelope and exaggerated the colors a little bit to make it more painterly, more a piece of art, more an impression than a photograph. I mean, the last thing we want to do is create a photograph. So I've left little bits of white in the snowfield. Typically, you're going to have shadows going across a snowfield, and you're going to have areas that are a little bit more brilliant in white. You've got all this little areas where the blooming water kind of repelled the darker pigments, and it looks like blowing snow a little bit. So it just is, it's a very kind of gusty, windy day up in the mountains. You better have your long johns on because it's kind of cold, and hope you're dressed warm.